I just want to do a small introduction to this amazing event that we have. We've organized this as part of a studio sessions for the MRH Design Practice program in collaboration with the Interiors Department, because we've all been keenly awaiting to hear from Caroline. And the Design Practice program is going to have an intake of new students starting in January, so applications are open right now. And what we've been doing is having a series of talks with people that are really fundamental to our curriculum and our module structure. So I just wanted to introduce Caroline and explain why she is so important to us. Caroline is co-founder of FranklinTill, a design futures consultancy, activating color and material innovation for positive social and environmental change. In a rapidly changing world, FranklinTill supports some of the world's largest brands and organizations to remain inspired, connected, and relevant. Previously, Caroline was directing Material Futures postgraduate course at Central St. Martin's, and she is co-author of Radical Matter, which Design Practice will know very well. This is Rethinking Materials for a Sustainable Future. She's also guest curator of the exhibition Our Time on Earth that opened at the Barbican in 2022 and continues to tour globally. Radical Matter challenges conventional notions of sustainability by proposing 8 big ideas that reframe materials as active agents in systemic change, social, economic, and ecological. Rather than treating materials as inert sources, the book explores how they can disrupt extractive models and enable regenerative futures. So why are we here? This book resonates deeply with the MRH Design Practice module that we've been working on called Material Processes. And in this module, we interrogate not only the physical properties of materials, but also the process behind their making. And we try to reveal invisible, intangible links between extraction, exploitation, innovation, inequality, ecology, and economy. So Caroline's lecture is going to help all of us question, how can material innovation move beyond technical fixes to address structural inequalities and ecological collapses? Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks. Yeah, no, thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here. I graduated about 20 years ago from here, so it's nice that I met my husband here, so always helped to spend very well. So yeah, today I was going to start by just telling you a bit about FranklinTill and who we are, what we do, and then to go on just to talk a bit about some of the research that we've been exploring recently and a kind of bigger picture exploration of what we see the role of materials in design at the moment, and just to hopefully provide some inspiration, some kind of thought starters. I've got far too many slides, I'm aware, so I might kind of gently skip over some bits, just so I don't sort of overrun too much. Oh no, the first thing would be good if I had slides moved on. Sorry, I might have to do a little bit of an exit and then come back in again. Oh, yeah, I've got a full. Sorry. Yeah, is there frozen. A frozen. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. Amazing. Okay. So yeah, we've been running 15 years, 16 years next year, and it's my mum still goes, what is it that you do? And yeah, it's a bit of ambiguity, but I guess what we're always doing is trying to activate the future materials and really support our clients to explore what does that mean, and more importantly, how can they action that? This sort of idea of sustainability not being a trend is at the very bedrock of what we do. We don't believe that you can talk about futures unless you're deeply entrenching the sustainable agenda in every aspect. And I'll talk a bit about this as we move through. But so we've been running 15 years and we've watched the sustainable trajectory kind of, grow from the perspective of, I don't like the word consumer. I've prescribed to the kind of John Alexander approach to talk about citizens rather than consumers, just as a side note, because I think otherwise it sort of prescribes us all as buying things constantly. So from a citizen mindset perspective, we've seen an awareness of sustainability grow. From a company perspective within the large corporates that we're working within, there's been a, impetus to do more and to have a perspective and to really embed it in their actions. And so we've seen this, the last decade, this, really great growth in awareness and concern around sustainability. But in the last 2 years, particularly, we've seen a big drop off. It's something I'll talk more about as we progress, but for me personally and for us as a company, we find this really worrying. There's a lot of rollback. Obviously, the larger sort of political landscape is more permissive than ever. You can roll back on everything from diversity and inclusion to sustainability initiatives. And so many of our clients are, and where a marketing budget is not allocated to sustainability, then often it means that kind of the innovation budget follows that marketing budget. So it's some challenging times that we're in at the moment, but I'll show you why I'm still positive. So we exist to inform design futures, colour futures and material futures. So we sort of aim to activate the future of design, colour and material to drive positive change. And I think the thing that gets me out of bed in the morning is that we're always doing something really different. So we're really lucky to work across disciplines. At the moment, we're working with some of the world's largest electronic companies. We're working with a massive flooring company. We're working with apparel. We're working with automotive. So there's a real kind of diversity, but we're entrenched within the design teams, within these huge corporations. And so we get to kind of really see across kind of discipline what are the concerns, what are the challenges. And so we can kind of bring that sort of overview perspective into each project. So as mentioned in that lovely intro, so in 2018, actually, we published Radical Matter, and this was a kind of culmination of about 10 years of work. So I wrote the Material Futures course at Central St Martin's. So actually, the first thing I did when I graduated here, I studied textiles originally, but my work was always about the convergence of disciplines. So I was really interested in the convergence of design and science, particularly to create a material future. And actually, the first thing I did was I was briefed to initiate relationships between Imperial and the RCA, which was, I think, the sort of foundation of the collaborative masters that exists now. And actually, my biggest tool was beer, free beer. Anyway, so Radical Matter was the kind of culmination of 10 years of thinking around materials, and really a call to action to say materials are the bedrock of design. If we think deeply about, where we're harvesting or sourcing our material from, what is the process of transformation it's going through, and what happens at end of life, and indeed how we can think about that end of life piece at the beginning of the design process, and the impact we can have is massive. So I'm not going to sort of dwell too much on the content of Radical Matter today, if that's right, because it feels like 18 years ago, even though, hopefully some of it still feels really relevant. More the case studies I'm going to show you today are hopefully a bit more current and indeed future facing. So I guess we came from a publications background as well as producing Radical Matter. We also edited magazines for many years. So we edited Viewpoint Colour and Viewpoint Design for 10 years. And I think what we're always passionate about is having an external viewpoint. So, a broad scan of what's going on within global design. And particularly these magazines were asking why. Why is this the emerging colour landscape? Why does this feel relevant and resonant now? And, within design, within Viewpoint Design, we were looking at some of the biggest themes. So quite abstract themes like rebellion or like think small, and doing that kind of outward looking, which is really the value that we bring to companies today. Even within some of the smartest minds in these massive corporations, it always astounds me how little they look outwards. And they are completely entrenched in kind of this sort of messy interior world, and so we are often this periscope to kind of look upward and look outward. And so I think I've got just three client projects to show you. I'll just mention the publications work, and some of our business model is that we do consultancy work, which then feeds our self-initiated work. So Radical Matter, publications, I'll show you our time on Earth. That's self-initiated work. It's money that we don't it's projects, it's work that we don't receive money for often, or indeed makes a loss, which is funded by the kind of consultancy work. And I guess what drives our purpose is how can we disseminate what is the future of materials, and indeed a future of materials that can lead us towards a more sustainable future. So just an example of some of the sort of consultancy work, we're often, these companies come to us with kind of half-baked briefs in a way. They sort of have an inkling of the type of question that they're trying to explore, but not really fully formed. And so a big part of what we do is help them to sort of form the brief. So we work within a big global sportswear company, and they are continually asking us, what is the future of colour material and how can we activate it? So the work basically begins with a big research piece, like a big sort of deep dive research report that's fully visualised and aiming to be as accessible as possible. And through that deep dive research, we then curate a series of themes. We're kind of making some big thematics that we think are what we call platforms for innovation. So, what are these big themes that we can sort of distill a really broad research scoping piece of work into 3 opportunities or 5 opportunities. So within this project, there were 3 big sort of pillars or platforms for innovation that came out. And within this project, we initiated what we called the Material Disruptors Programme. So we brought in 3 designers or they might do a designer or a material scientist or a studio that's doing something sort of relevant within this theme. And what's so nice about that is that we bring them into a design team that are really quite disconnected from the process of design. They've all been to art school or trained in design, but they've almost become specifiers. They're time poor, they're restricted, with budget. And so we're trying to kind of reignite their juices, if you like, to really get their kind of creative juices flowing again. And our clients talk a lot about working on stream and off stream. So on stream is a project brief that's got a really determined timescale and budgetary implications. Whereas off stream is like ongoing stuff that's not necessarily, specifically relevant to someone or something. You can imagine that if you're only working on stream, your opportunity to innovate is quite limited. So often we're trying to kind of open up a longer timescale to be able to do that off stream kind of thinking and material research that then can feed in when relevant. So this is an example of a kind of slightly longer term off-stream type approach, if that makes sense. So I'm probably chucking lots of terminology at you. Here we were exploring things like zeros, and we brought in an amazing designer, Bonnie Hinneman, who is a Danish designer. She forms a natural materials studio, and we were looking at like bio-based material alternatives for soles. We brought in Charlotte Worth. We were looking at living colour. How can we actually harness the idea of bacterial colour? Can you see who the client is there? So I'll gently flick over that because I think this is being recorded. So how can you kind of get these big ideas like bacterial colour, rather than you specifying a dye stuff with your dye lab and it being, fabric or material being dyed in the, tens of thousands of meters? How can we look at grown living bacterial colour as a stainage, which is, and there's a huge amount of sort of sustainable innovation potential within that. But they need to actually understand this technology before they can sort of get to grips with, okay, how can it start to impact our design process? So, these are sort of thought starters in a way, concept cards, like really trying to unpack the potential. And this was something called evolving colour. So we were looking at how can we consider a product to not be at its best in terms of colour and material when it first comes out of the box. How can we encourage longevity or wearing in, or a sense of kind of aging beautifully. Kind of trying to disrupt the way that this company work with colour and material. And this was a bit of a longer scale project for a massive apparel conglomerate called VF Corporation. Has anyone heard of VF? Somebody's nodding. It's really interesting because we haven't actually until they approached us, but I presume that you've heard of Timberland, of who else could say, Wrangler, Lee. So basically, they're the largest apparel conglomerate in the world, and they have a jeanswear and an active wear kind of two centres. And there's some amazing sustainable innovation happening within like Timberland, but then you've got people like John Barbados or Lee, or brands that really just aren't kind of exploring material innovation and sustainability. So our brief was to curate a massive internal exhibition called Future Wear, which took us sort of 2 years worth of research, in which we did all of the sort of initial research, curated 8 chapters, and then appointed 8 different lead curators for each area. So we had things like this was Make It Mine, so this was looking at a future of personalisation and customisation. We had I can't remember what that was called, but that was all centred around sort of responsible living, sustainability, and this is health and well-being. How can apparel actually enable and sort of improved health and well-being? So basically, we had to oversee about 86 working prototypes of work, and it was often about pairing like a material scientist with a designer to sort of realise these things. And then also we oversaw the design of the exhibition itself. So this is a while ago now. This is probably about 8 years ago. But it was a great project, and it kind of brought together all of our skill set in terms of that initial research, the building of a framework, the kind of bringing together of innovators, and then the overseeing of the realisation. And then there's 46,000 members of staff in their design team globally, but it was only the top sort of 2,000 team members that actually came to the physical exhibition. And then it had to be broken up in travel, but we also had to create a desktop version so that people could actually access all of the knowledge within the exhibition without actually having been there. So we also had to oversee the creation of an app, which was our first kind of like digital exhibition format, which was really interesting. And including, we had to sort of make videos of behind the scenes of going into the making of the works. And what's so nice about this project is that so many of the relationships still exist within these brands. So they were basically sort of using this as a shopping list innovation, that it was an idea that was, almost fully realised for them, that they could then initiate collaboration with these partnerships, and kind of so much of it is still going on. And then kind of more in the more public-facing work, we've got a long-standing relationship with trade fairs like High Textile and Tech Textile. So they're the world's largest trade fairs for interior textiles and technical textiles, so particularly smart textiles, and happens every year, and Tech Textiles every 2 years in Germany and Frankfurt. So these are vast trade fairs. Messe Frankfurt is actually miles long in terms of its. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Frankfurt. Yeah, one of the most overwhelming places that you can imagine. And we have had this sort of decade-long relationship with them to curate their future space. So really, we came saying that we want a really sort of accessible format for your visitors to experience, what's the future of material and textile, to hopefully, initiate new thinking within. If you're a brand, how you're working with material, or, if you're a buyer thinking about potential new sort of partnerships. So we started with the Heim Textile Future Materials Library, which we were running for sort of 10 years, and really sort of showcasing emerging material innovation. And I think what's nice, like putting it in people's hands so that they can really tangibly experience those materials. And then more recently, we curated the regenerative materials library, which was we're really interested in the vocabulary around sustainability and materials. And we have this kind of changing vocabulary. And I think it's so important that we sort of get together and have a shared definition, so that we know what we're coalescing around. So this was our sort of exploration into actually what is a regenerative material, because there's increasingly this concern that perhaps sustainability is not enough. By definition, it's sort of about maintaining the status quo. And indeed, we need to go beyond that. I'll talk a bit more about that in some of my later slides. But this was basically us sort of making a series of principles, exploring, what could be the principles that could create a definition of what a regenerative material is. and trying to create a very makeshift kind of pop-up, pop-down regenerative library. So it's designed to be very easily constructed, just with these hempcrete blocks, and showing these, I think it's nine principles, and indeed like showing a sort of physical example of each of those, so that you could see that, you know, that concept applied in a real sort of example. So then today I was just going to, actually just out of interest, because this is a very similar talk to one that I did as a keynote last week at the Materials Matter first conference. Was anybody there? That's really good. We're not going to bore them.
It's we're all teaching.
That's excellent, yeah, because they're not going to be like, oh, she's a one-trick pony. I thought I'd do a bit of a... So that's a bit of an introduction to what we do at FranklinTill. There's a couple of other projects that I've seen throughout. I thought it would be good to sort of give a bit of a big picture where we're thinking in relation to materials. So I was talking about from sustainability to circularity to regeneration and beyond. And just to sort of look at where we are now, I find this sort of piece of data really helpful. That we are at this point that it's unequivocal that human activity has huge impact and is changing the makeup of our systems. We are changing our biosphere. And, you know, this mapping, this great acceleration shows the mapping of socio-economic trends against system trends. And obviously the correlation is almost exact. So we can no longer have this conversation about, you know, has human activity, is it changing the planet? Yes, it definitively is. And in terms of our relationship with materials, you know, we are in this linear process of take, make, discard, and we are operating at about 2.5 planets worth of the resource. Earth Overshoot Day, probably many of you have heard of this, is created by the Global Footprint Network. It's the day in which, within a year, we have depleted more natural resource than the Earth can regenerate. And as you can imagine, it's shifting further and further forward. So I think last year, it was on August the 3rd. So obviously it's sort of retreating more towards the early stages of the year more quickly. So this is a rare earth mine just on the edge of Mongolia, which is being mined for rare earth minerals that are going into a huge amount of mobile devices, electronic devices. And this mine reported that over 2/3 of material has now been mined. So the point of depletion in many material sources is actually very close now. I spoke about this with one of our sportswear clients when I was out in the US a couple of weeks ago. It was so interesting that one of the heads of sustainability said, Caroline, can you give us the exact data, the materials that we may use? Can you tell us when is the year that they are going to run out? And I just thought, wow, that's such an interesting thing to say. Like, is that the only point at which you're going to act? It just seemed but also showed me the kind of value of quantifying this kind of information, because that kind of simplistic of a metric. But yeah, I just thought that was a really interesting kind of thing for somebody to say. So really the thing that we bang on about most within FranklinTill is that we need to stop thinking of material as kind of inanimate and really appreciate that a material is part of a constantly moving system. It's not an inanimate thing. We've got to consider, when we look at material, we consider using material, we have to understand the full system in which this material exists, and indeed how we can keep it in that system. And obviously there's amazing work done by people like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. This is their kind of circular journey diagram, which is so fascinating, going into brands and if we show this and we talk about this, the design team say, I'm aware of circularity and I kind of look at that and sort of get it, but I just don't really understand it, and I really don't understand how it relates to our work. So while kind of system diagrams and system thinking is really important, what I feel like really passionate about is how do we apply this? What does this mean? How do we support designers to understand, how to make these fully informed decisions? But it is important and this is the bit, obviously I studied nearly 20 years ago now, and within textiles, I was lucky. I had in my VA at Leeds University, had technical material training and colour chemistry training, which at the time I thought this is diabolically boring. And now think, thank God, when I was studying here, we weren't taught about anything to do with sustainability. It was off my own back. There was one senior research fellow, Dr. Joan Farrer, who was hated by pretty much all of my faculty because she was challenging. That was my saviour kind of thing. And I'm sure you guys are, way more advanced than where I was. But it's just amazing how many designers that we work with within these massive companies that are making huge decisions with massive volume materials don't understand that, there is a technical system and there is a biological system. So yeah, how do we think about getting people to understand material system, and is something that I feel very preoccupied with. And I was just going to show you one example of, this is a flooring company that we work with who have an incredible circular system. They have done their homework. They've embedded circularity in what they do, and they've done the research for 10 plus years, and they've achieved a circular system, but they've just done such a shitty job of communicating it. So I'm not saying this is the best example in the world, but I think that if we're talking about dynamic systems, we have to use dynamic communication. So we've been working with them to create some animations, and I just thought I'd show you one. Oh no, I'm going to tell everybody one. So that's actually much nicer if you can hear the sounds than how would it that. Sorry, leave me. Oops. Is that right? Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So essentially, thank you. Okay. Yeah. So we created for them a sort of communication strategy, which we called the beauty of circularity. And this is now, we've been working on this for 3 years with them now. And really, basically, they had getting them to understand that they've nailed the 3 sort of really key parts of circularity. They're designing their product with the end at the beginning. They're using materials that enable them to be deconstructed and reconstructed infinitely. And the most unsexy piece, but almost the most challenging piece, is the logistics part, that they can get their material back. So the circular journey, actually, they've got this thing called Restart. So they've got a network all over the world that enables whoever it is that's taking up the product to give it back to them. And that is actually the most challenging piece. It's the piece that most global companies can't do or haven't quite worked out how. And it's still, Target, the most challenging thing for them, because they've got to they've got to consider themselves the custodian of the material, and they've got to guide it back because it is their raw material that they need to remake from. But sort of by breaking down, and the interesting thing about that animation that I just showed you is that we thought this is to speak to your audience, this is to speak to your potential customers. But what it actually did was it created this amazing alignment internally, because all from their sales team to their design team to all of the sort of internal stakeholders suddenly went, oh, that's how we do it. And I get it now. And so there was this kind of interesting aha moment. And everything we've been trying to do with them is about showing rather than telling. So how can we do really simple photo shoots that you don't need to read any copy, you don't need to like have a technical understanding of this. You can just understand that this material is going on a journey, and it's going through changing states, it's transforming, but it is closed loop. So yeah, this idea, and the other thing that we've been playing on is the kind of visceral experience of materials. Like, how can we invite people to actually engage with the different change material states? And it's not rocket science, but just kind of understanding that when you disconnect your pile from the backing, when you disassemble it and your backing gets shredded, it looks like this, and inviting people to plunge their hands into it. So we've done a lot of exhibitions at places like the Land Design Week or 3 Days of Design in Copenhagen, so to actually invite the audience to like plunge their hand in, to really experience the change in material states. And it's been really successful, actually, just in terms of a sort of depth of understanding, and for me also the point of repetition, to say, right, this is the beauty of circularity, this is our communication strategy, we're not changing it, we're going to stick with it, and we're going to really kind of go deep into what does that mean and how we do it. We get to speak to lots of exciting people through the publications that we make and the reports that we do. And this was a quote that really, I think it's actually in Radical Matter, from Anders Lendinger, the architect and founder of the Lendinger Group in Scandinavia. And he says, "We have all the materials we need, they're already here, and true innovation can create new materials out of what we have to give them new values." And I just really like that idea that we don't need new material, we have them all. And imagine if we kind of put a stake in the ground now and just said, right, we're not going to extract any new virgin material, and the level of kind of ingenuity or innovation that would give rise to. And there's lots of people like Helen Kirkham, thank you, who sadly just announced that she was closing her studio this week. So for a decade, she's been doing this incredible job of kind of saying, look at the level of technical innovation that we have in materials, particularly in footwear. Like, these materials are designed for longevity. They're having incredible performance benefits, and we're, wearing it and then chucking it away. So she's been doing this meticulous, like, overground mining and deconstructing and making that deconstruction beautiful. And also that kind of reconstruction interesting. So at the moment, we're in that blue cycle of that Ellen MacArthur. We're in that technical cycle. We're looking at human-made technical materials and how do you give them new values. So, and that can be as simple as repair, like we've seen with the Beasley Brothers repair shop. So that was just a sort of this assemblage approach of furniture, and then adding in this repaired jumper, and in collaboration with Freddie Robbins, who I think is still here, who's one of my tutors. So yeah, we've been in that blue cycle, as I mentioned, but there is a huge amount of innovation going on in that green cycle in biological material in ways that you just would not expect. So people like Carbon Cell, who I think you might say came from here. I think they were on. Was it the mix within? Yes, it was. Yes. Yeah. So they are really on an amazing journey to create an alternative to a polymer-based like foam that you see in most packaging for sort of electric or electronic or sort of delicate products. So they're creating this really high performance expanding foam using a biochar, which is a really interesting material, which is kind of encapsulating carbon, so capturing carbon and then adding it with a bio-based polymer. And they're kind of similar to so Ruby is a company that's a lot of the apparel companies are starting to collaborate with. They're creating fibre yarns that are actually captured from pollution. And so I thought these examples were just interesting to show, because there's a lot of companies that are doing sort of saying, okay, this idea of giving materials new value, that we can actually think of pollution as a material. We can look at the effluence of the Anthropocene, as in, the era in which humans are changing the biosphere, changing the makeup of our planet. How can we capture those effluents and indeed turn them into useful materials? So Ruby is capturing CO2 in the atmosphere and converting it into cellulose pulp using enzyme, basically, and then spinning that into fibre. So it goes back into the biological cycle. So it is a sort of cellulose-based fibre. So as I mentioned, this almost like a spectrum, that there's this acknowledgement that sustainability in material perhaps is no longer enough, because by definition that's about maintaining the status quo. And indeed, if we go kind of a step further to circularity, as in we look to keep things in closed loop systems and leave no trace, is that indeed enough? The detrimental effect that we have had on the planet, many people are saying we need to go beyond that. We need to, and that's where regenerative approaches, regenerative design or regenerative material come in. The idea of trying to put back better, to replenish, to restore. And this is a basic kind of rudimentary attempt at a definition to sort of help us to sort of have a sense of alignment. So if we look at that regenerative end and just talk about a couple of examples, this is Ponder, and they are a textile company, and they're looking to provide an alternative to synthetic polymer-based fillers that we use within architectural settings, we use within bedding, within clothing, like puffer jackets, for example. And their material is harvested from the bulrush. So they are really interesting as a regenerative material because their work is also about regenerating wetlands where the bulrush is harvested from. And those is a really important ecosystem because it's often sort of home to a peatland, which is sequestering a huge amount of carbon. So it's like a win-win situation that's, you know, a sort of trying to rejuvenate an important, delicate ecosystem, but then also a material sort of that can be harvested that's without polymer. And when we talk about a regenerative material, it feels really important to often the companies that we work with go straight to the environmental aspect. But within regeneration is super important to talk about the social aspect. And this is an example that we've done some work with in the past with Christopher Farr, who is a rug company, essentially. And they work still to this day, the majority of kilims are created in Turkey, which is a traditional flat weave rug. And 95% of the women, and it is usually all women, that weave the kilim exist with no reliable income, no pension, and kind of very volatile to changes in the economy in terms of material. And so this is an organisation that Christopher Farr work with called Kerkit, and they exist to support these women to make sure that they have access to pension, that they have stable, reliable kind of pricing structure. So it's, just felt important to touch on the idea that a regenerative material has got to be socially regenerative, and how can that sort of rebuild, regenerate community as well as environmentally regenerative. And then I was going to end by just touching on some kind of ideas of, what beyond being, a physical system and the building blocks of design, what is, the role or a contemporary role of material. And I've already talked about storytelling and the importance of kind of being able to communicate the system in which our materials exist. And there's some companies that are kind of going one step further to tell their own story, or indeed I like this example as an example of a company that's sort of eating their own waste. Mm-hmm. So this is Trade, the textile recycling company that you probably know. I just come from Shepherd's Bush. There's one on Shepherd's Bush High Street. So they commissioned James Shaw, who was also product design a few years after me, I think. And they gave him a sort of harvest of unwearable clothes or unusable textile that would have otherwise gone to landfill. And James used this as the source of material to create components and furniture and fixtures and fittings for this store. So yeah, I just really like that idea of kind of eating your own waste. And it's something we've been doing some large scale projects with IKEA to explore how can the store actually be the micro factory of the future as well. So, you know, you're almost having these sort of micro ecosystems rather than being a global distributor. And it feels really important at this point in time when we're being divided as much as we are. We live in polarized times, to think of material as community. And this was one of the students I had the pleasure of working with on Material Futures, Sana Vissa. And she worked with human hair, has done for about 12 years now. And sometimes when I present this, I look at it and go, what could be more regenerative than human hair? And there's lots of brilliant men. So it's a bit triggering. So I think everybody's got a lot of hair in this room today, so hopefully not too triggering. So she works with human hair as a regenerative material, but also this was a lovely pop-up she did at Milan where she worked with local Milanese barbers. You could get a haircut and then you could contribute your harvest, and also give some ideas as to what you wanted, what you thought this could be. So she's worked with traditional rope makers over the years to explore different applications for human hair. And this is her more recent work called Hair Cycle, which is, for me, is one of the most robust examples of regenerative design in material and in social infrastructure. And she was given funding by Newham Council, and she set up, she has a little hub, a little redundant retail shop in Newham. And within Newham, there are 260 hairdressers and barbers. So this is a, pretty prolific source. So she's got hubs within these barbers, and she's collecting material. And what I think is so amazing about that is that she's having conversations about sustainability with people that would not be talking about sustainability. And I'm really fascinated about the barber or the hairdresser as one of the sort of pillars of community that so many walks of life are coming to on a monthly or whatever, however after we get our hair cut. So yeah, she's had this brilliant connection with these. This is her opening her retailers, obviously cutting hair rope. But also she's been running amazing workshops with the design community, but also the wider community in Newham, and working with designers as collaborators to explore potential applications. And then at a larger scale, looking at sort of large-scale ambition of application for hair as fertilizer, as textiles, and she's just launching some products in the built environment as well. So it feels like a really lovely, holistic case study, and she's been working for 10 years doing mapping around this material. And then material as locale. I know probably got quite a lot of architects in the room. This is something that I think is really interesting, this rise of real concern for hyperlocal material. This is an architect that's working near me in Somerset that's called Studio Saar. I don't know if you don't know them, they're definitely worth looking up their work. So they're an Anglo-Indian architect, so half based in the West Country, UK, and half in India. And they work on very localised projects. And this is an example in Somerset. They're just doing the rejuvenation of what was an agricultural series of buildings, and it's becoming a regenerative food centre. And I thought what was so interesting about Johnny, the lead architect's starting process, was that he's created this infrastructure to do like a mapping of the existing materials on site. Because his belief is that the future of architecture is retrofit. And the first thing we should do is map the raw materials that are available currently on site. So when you do your first site visit, you basically do, I can't remember what he calls it, he's got a nice name for this, it's that diagram at the top. And he categorises those materials, and he makes sure that the end future design is incorporating those materials into it. So, I mean, it's kind of basic, but just really nice. And then this is an example of one of their Indian projects. And what I loved about this, so this is a kind of, they did a pavilion based on it, but this is the actual example, and it's obviously a shade, a kind of pavilion structure next to a big building that they created. And Johnny was saying, well, why do we need to always think of materials in architecture for the longest term, and this was designed to fail. So it would need constant maintenance. So it was using local craft and local material, so that obviously as it failed or as it needed to be, updated, there would be another form of employment and local kind of infrastructure. So they're doing some really exciting work around sort of material as locale. This I thought was really relevant from James from Assemble Architects, that building regulations have been designed around the property of industrialised, standardised products and how these materials perform. But if we're going to transition to a culture of using materials that are organic and which may vary from place to place, we also need to design different frameworks of regulation to allow for that. Because one of the biggest challenges we find when we're working within architecture, the barrier to material innovation being adopted is very, very rigorous and standardised forms of safety, of certification. So, how can we challenge that? Feels really important. I'm going to hurry up because I'm sure that you're all getting weary. This room's quite hot, isn't it? So it's probably lulling you to sleep with my voice. I'll just mention material meets AI. There's some really exciting examples of new material companies that are using massive data models in AI to expedite the development of sustainable materials. So, for example, Selena or Basecamp Research, which now say they have the largest database of bio-based material genome. They've been doing tracking and field work all over the world. They believe that the key to our material future is in nature, but we actually don't have very many samples of the kind of the genome of materials that we need to kind of find more sustainable examples. So they're doing this combination of geography, of like global field work, and using AI to sort of expedite the development of bio-based material innovation, which is similar to Materium, which I'm sure some of you have come across, the platform for recipes of bio-based materials. And it's kind of like an open source platform. And they've had a big grant from Google to help them use AI to expedite the development and also the selection of what's the most appropriate bio-based material. So, I think that it's something really interesting where we see the convergence of really high technology AI as a kind of scoping or data analysis model to sort of expedite our search or quest for more sustainable materials. And then I think this is the last point I was going to make. Material is collaboration. As I mentioned, that my background is all about the convergence of the worlds of science and design. So students that have gone on to create businesses like Modern Synthesis by Jen Keane, or Radiant Matter, whose ambition was to create a bio-based alternative to the sequin, or Natsai Chaser, the founder of Faber Futures, who was the first one to kind of create that dye made from bacterial colour, so looking at staining rather than using water within the dye process. And Natsai has gone on to create this amazing platform. If you don't know it, definitely check out Normal Phenomena of Life. It's her latest collaborative platform, actually with you guys. So I think I've got your one. Guys from Mitre Mondays worked in collaboration with Natsai. So Natsai was really keen to explore how to put bio-based materials into a kind of e-commerce platform model, to explore what does this mean? Are people ready for the variation that comes about with bio-based material? The imperfection, can we embrace the characteristics of nature in the products that we surround ourselves with? Are we ready to wait a bit longer, perhaps? Are we ready to have less reliable supply chains? So she wanted to explore all of these ideas, but also, make commercially available, beautiful, bio-based innovation in the kind of commercial product realm. And then, the note I wanted to end on, it feels like a really important moment. Personally, I feel really buoyed by what's going on politically. I think we've had some relatively dark times, and then look at I'm very excited by Zoran Mandani personally. And, you know, we have like bold political voices like Polanski coming, you know, cutting through the noise. And so I feel passionately that we have sort of, I've worked in futures for 20 years, and I think the word future has never been more negative. You know, future used to be something aspirational and, you know, and now it feels very uncertain and volatile. And I feel that we've sort of taken that away from our kids and the younger generation. So, I feel that a lot of these projects are sort of a tangible example of hope. So sort of material as hope. Hope is a word that I'm really interested in at the moment. And it feels like we sort of catch them. And I just wanted to end on the exhibition that we worked on with the Barbican that opened in 2022 and is still sort of touring the world, because there's this really interesting discipline that's emerging called imagination activism. I don't know if you guys have come across people like Phoebe Tickle, and Rob, who's last name, written loads of wonderful books, and he's just written a book called Falling Back in Love and Future. And imagination activism I'm really interested in, but I think we kind of do it as designers. That's what we're making a vision of what the future could be, and we're making it tangible so that people can relate to it and perhaps that we can all aim for it. And that, in essence, what our time on Earth was. We were asked to be the guest curators of an exhibition about climate emergency, and we said, you know, I've worked with so many students on material futures that say, Caroline, like the most sustainable thing I could do is just not get out of bed in the morning. and yes, that may be true, but that doesn't really help anyone. So actually, how can we kind of develop shared visions of what a future could be, what a flourishing future could be? And that was what Our Time on Earth was trying to do. And really open with this idea, like, we're a living, breathing being within a living planet. Like, holy shit, isn't that amazing? And like, don't we forget that so much? And with all the complexity that's going on in the world, that's, as a designer, for me, that's the thing that like I come back to most often. Like, wow, I'm a living, breathing being within the planet. And this is what we tried to remind people of when they entered. So there was this audio spoken by the rapper Speech to Bell, and we had this massive projection by a Marshmallow Laser Feast, which was basically speaking about interconnection and showing that, you know, the tree is absorbing carbon dioxide, excreting oxygen, and we're deeply interconnected. And we had the best thing for me at this exhibition was doing the school tours. I think we took through at least 150 schools, like over a period of 3 months, and like the conversations. And there was a kid that was like, yeah, but like forests aren't alive, they don't move. And it was like, whoa, okay. And then we had a really amazing conversation, and then he got to the point where it's like, right, so like a forest is like busier than a car park. And it was, yeah, just sort of wonderful. And we had these, imagine a world in which these 10 like provocations, I think like 2 of which were existing work, 8 were new commissions, which often we partnered with climate scientists, with designers, or with artists. And I was just going to touch on 2, I think, to end. Imagine a world in which Indigenous innovation engineers the future. And this was about trying to subvert our perspective of often like the northern hemisphere, or and being the forges of innovation and leading in terms of science and technology. And actually, we wanted to sort of say, well, really, we need to subvert that. And there's so much wisdom embedded in traditional ecological knowledge, and how can we unpack that? So we worked with 3 groups of Indigenous architects. So this from the Kaistas community in northern India, the creators of the Root Tree Bridge, and we partnered them with Bureau Happold, one of the biggest sort of engineering firms, and the low-tech architects were the kind of project leaders, and they were applied to like site-specific projects, and came up with some really beautiful work. And the thing that's like most pleasing about it for me is the legacy of it. They're still going, these collaborations are sort of still rich. And then maybe I'll just end with the last one. So imagine a world in which global knowledge meets local material. Another really nice applied example of localized material. this was working with Build X Studio. So they're a Kenyan-based architectural studio, and they have Kenya and the locale that they're working with has a real issue with exploding population and lack of housing, lack of affordable, high quality housing. So they had basically, these 3 films show, they've been creating housing and actually building it just using 3 localized materials, CLT, is that right? Cross-laminated timber, yeah. So from grown from a local sustainably managed forest, compressed stabilized earth blocks, which were created from the site that it was excavated from, and mycelium, so from mushroom-based material that was grown in localized microfactories. So from those 3 materials, they have been kind of creating these really high quality, low cost housing, showing that localized material can actually respond to a housing crisis. So yeah, for me that was, and the whole kind of point of the exhibition design in itself, the framework of the exhibition, we created these 2 kind of concepts: radical abundance in material and radical transparency, that we wrote up everything that we learned. And so there's sort of a charter that was created for touring exhibitions as a result. So just end with somebody's words that's going to be more articulate than me. This is taken from an amazing novel by the writer Amitav Ghosh called The Nutmeg's Curse. And he said, "We have a modern view of the earth as inanimate, and we've treated the planet as an inert repository of resources for a very long time. And we have to find ways to restore life." And I think that's what encapsulates so much of our work, is sort of reminding us that the planet and these natural resources, it's not an inert repository. How can we, treat it as a living being? Thank you. That's what I love to
Thank you so much. Oh, I'm sure there's lots of questions. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead. And
well, first, thank you. I was super excited. It wasn't boring at all. All time. While you were going through different process of experimenting and showing us all the different discoveries that you have made, I was wondering, how do you deal with the uncertainty at the beginning? It is something that I feel right now with my materials, that I don't know what's going to be my end result. And thinking that you have a client as well to deliver, how do you manage that? Do you have different pathways? Or how do you deal with that unknown and uncertainty of the starting?
But yeah, I mean, I love the question. If it's all right, I'll answer it first with my like sort of material futures hat on, if you like. So we always used to emulate the practice of research through making. That I think there's a great design process where you do a load of research, context-based or user-based, and you define a need, and then you kind of do a sketch and you make the thing that you sketch. And we were trying to sort of disrupt that by saying, go through the lens of the material, explore the material through happy accident and through delving into the properties of the material. And only once you really kind of allow yourself to indulge in that does the true kind of relevant application and context come, if that makes sense. So I often see a lot of students that are coming to me and going, yeah, but I want to frame this as an innovator. They're trying to push themselves to make something that it's not necessarily ready to be applied to. So I'm a big advocate for research through making, and so you allow that material. You really, we used to call it like chef's approach. So the way a chef like works with beetroot and goes, I'm going to do 100 different things with beetroot. It kind of go as far as you can through the lens of that material. And then through that, you start to go, oh, I've discovered it can do this, and then you start to think of the context and the application that it can exist within. But you're doing that through the lens of the property of the material and the exploration of that. So that's the teaching approach that we used to advocate for in material features. And in the work that I do now, like, the uncertainty is often when we're doing the research, we don't really know. So, for example, we're working with a massive electronics company at the moment, and they're asking us, like, what's the future of health and wearables, and how can that support purposeful application? Like, so we could go, okay, let's start exploring applications for mental health, and but actually we're just going, okay. And my team are feeling a bit nervous because it's massive, right? It's a massive. So I'm just going to meet this morning, and they're going, there's so much research here, and it's really messy, and we have to go through that. So I'm kind of saying to them that I can see them starting to, like, formulate opportunities and go, like, oh, there's loads of, ring stick. Let's start thinking about it. And it's like, let's just go first and, like, really delve into behaviour in health. How are people thinking and feeling in relation to health? So we're at this really messy stage, and we have to be comfortable with that level of uncertainty. And then through that, it is basically coming out with, whatever you call it, themed platforms. Like, it sounds like basic, but it's the ability to then, like, get all that mess out on the table and together formulate it into some piles, basically, not those pilots that children. But yeah, and sort of give them a title. Titles are always really helpful. I always used to say to students, like, commit to a project title, because then you're like, then you can go all the way around it. Once you've fixed something, then you do. Am I undermining it?
No, you are repeating exactly what you're doing. Absolutely.
Sadly, I don't touch going in.
Easy to our
Keep going.
without laughing. All that resonates perfectly together with,
Yeah, but like, yeah. So be comfortable with the discomfort. Like, yeah.
Yeah, and failure. We can feel it might not.
Yes, totally. Yes. Don't try and mitigate the failure. Yeah.
Learn from it.
Can I? Yeah. All right. First of all, thank you so much for this. It was so informative, and it was honestly fascinating, like, how much I didn't know. I'm not going to speak for the room. I have two questions. First is regarding the colors, because that resonates with one of the projects that I'm doing for material processes, where I've used dye colors for my project, and it's natural dyes. And when I was using them, I was informed from the dye lab that just because it's natural dye doesn't mean it has been accessed sustainably. So the fact that, you brought up the fact that we should be using living colors for bacteria. What I wanted to know, like, what sort of bacteria, like, research has been done that can't give off that color payoff, or, something that's should be at the moment an alternative to using these kind of dyes, because it's everywhere, it's not just in retail, but like in every single part of our lives, we use dyes in different aspects. So I just want to understand, like, what sort of bacteria are there that can give that color?
God, I'm not going to answer that question because I'm not the expert. But the thing I would always encourage is, don't try and go back over turf that's already been, like, collaborate. And that was the core to what we were doing at Material Futures, is to find the expert, work with them, because otherwise you're going to spend 2+ years going over the basics. And so I don't know the answer to the exact. I don't even know how they do it. And they worked in collaboration with scientists often. But somebody like Charlotte Worth, she works at, the company's called now Fab. Somebody's going to know probably that. They're that bio-based lab that's just opened up. No. Thanks. Say again?
The paper company.
No,
not
it's
paper
like,
clips.
I don't know. Anyway, it's kind of an open source like biolab, but like I'll just Google the name and just find it. I don't know if you guys would agree with that, but I think. I mean,
Colour of Saying have a lot of
Laura
does.
yeah. But also, I mean, I think that the natural colour space is complex. I think there's lots of different ways of approaching it. I think probably the textiles dial-up here. Yeah, I mean, they're probably talking about the mordants. The problem with a natural dye is that you still need a mordant to fix it, to make it hold and apply, which is often aluminium based or some kind of metallic.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't necessarily. It doesn't mean that it's like there were all sorts of companies that there's seaweed based dye, Zephyr based in the Netherlands. There's also. I mean, I'm just thinking we've written extensively about natural dye sources. I'm just wondering what I can point you towards.
Your website.
This
is FranklinTill.
Yeah. I mean, our website doesn't have anything directly on it, but probably our issues of viewpoint. The library was used to have it, and we've done so many articles about different rundowns of that. But there's all sorts of sources, and I think you could probably just go for it and find some existing technologies.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. My second question is, I see that you guys have worked with Target, which is honestly really interesting because I come from interior background and we've extensively worked with them and specified them. And it's very fascinating to know that this is one of their approaches that's currently happening. And like the exhibition that you guys set up, like to feel the materials, I just wanted to know, is it throughout their range that you guys are proposing for, or is it just like carpet tiles or like wooden planks?
So it is now. So we started with the carpet team, and the beauty of circularity was a carpet specific communication, but it was so well received that it's now the woman that commissioned us is now promoted and is head of communications across all ranges, which is great because it accesses us to work with all the different. So we've done a mapping of the circular journey of each of theirs. So we've now done lino. And actually, I sometimes feel like I'm sounding like an advert for Target, but they just got verified that they've got it's carbon negative product lino.
It was announced today, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. So there's HO, which is homogeneous vinyl, which is a polymer based, but it is completely closed loop circular. So we've just gone and done the mapping for each of their substrates, so that people can really sort of understand that the material journeys.
That's very interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Do you have online questions?
Not yet.
I mean, another musing, which would be good to get your thoughts on. So similar to space you could sell, and we always find these interesting technologies, so always smaller scale, and then it's when they scale up, either they can cause a problem, they start overusing the resource in their own right, or they just never quite break out of the bedroom or the garage, you know what I mean? And I don't know if you've any thoughts or experience on the sweet spot.
It is a really interesting challenge. I mean, we have seen examples of sustainable material innovation that have scaled, but that has been within massive corporates that have a lot of money. But we work quite a lot with Jaguar Land Rover, and they're actually investing heavily.
Maybe that's what it needs, a big global brand almost take them on.
And also regulation, because regulation is other problems, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess that's diverse because there's an infrastructure that there's a financial. Yeah. I think then we had an event a few weeks ago at the Design Museum and we invited some emerging material companies, so like Carbon Cell and Marina Tex, who are working with like seafood waste and create, do you know them? Creating like a bio-based polymer for everyday packaging. And it's so heartbreaking to hear like their endeavours are so incredible, but the challenges are so great in terms of actually legislation is currently going against them. In terms of, you know, them being able to scale to mass market level. But so yeah, sorry, I'm not really being
I mean, it's an unanswerable question, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think sometimes there's examples of like it doesn't have to scale to be massive.
Well, I was wondering, you know, in architecture, because in some ways, like each building is bespoke, which is quite interesting with architecture. Whereas in mass produced good, it's literally mass produced.
Yeah.
But then the regulations are very, very limited.
That's why I think like Johnny's really interesting with that. I wish I could remember what he called it. It's like he sort of talks about that we need to become as good at disassembling as. So one of the technologies, for example, that Jaguar Land Rover has just invested in massively is a company that disassembles electric car batteries. And I love that idea that actually our kids are going to be disassemblers. My son would be brilliant at that. It's like, what can smash the shit out of inside that? And be, like I genuinely think that is going to be an emerging industry. And this thing that Johnny does is it's kind of created a formula to map the resources within an architectural site on arrival to then, you know, have that audit to then that be the site.
And then you just need, again, so I'm sorry to be the old negative Nelly here, but then the problem is then you really struggle to ensure that unless you definitively say this is X with properties A, B, C. But if you've got a private client, you'll take the risk on. But like anything can scale, it's so annoying.
Yes.
So I think going forward, as long as we can properly document what we use, then at least we're starting that loop.
Totally, and it's like material passports and all that.
How you responsibility in the system.
Exactly.
And
but also the onus. Like people always talk about that we need to shift citizen mindset, but no, I think that brands are the ones that need to take ultimate responsibility for every single material that they're.
It's like Target, right? The only reason that works is because they have that extended producer responsibility. And that's the only reason their thing is carbon negative. Because at the end of the life cycle, right? Otherwise, it's not.
But also,
it's accountability too, right? Like they need to become accountable.
100%.
And the thing that really frustrates me is that we still have this conversation that sustainable materials ultimately can be more expensive, so therefore we're not going to spec it. But the events that we're holding, working with an amazing professor at London Business School who is basically quantifying that soon these companies will not be able to afford not to shift to circularity because it's about security, it's about resilience, you're not going to be attracted to investment because your material sources are not going to be reliable. So he talks about that. The transition is going to happen. It's whether we choose for it to be orderly or disorderly, and so it's got to be this. Target are actually economically smart because they're getting ahead. And still that conversation is not quite landing, but see.
No, we need legislation, I guess.
That's the way, right?
And at the moment, that's going backwards.
That's the scary part,
which is just nonsensical, isn't it? So,
so we started this new program in MH Design Practice, and we have this one unit called Material Processes, and we thought it was going to be, this hub for sorts of emergent materials to come out. And because our students are brilliant, and very quickly we realised that actually what was really interesting was not the materials that they were developing, but the processes around how those materials were developed, or the conditions in which they were developed, or as you say, the viability of them. And so it's really interesting because in the studio we're having these conversations and we're like, oh, actually, let's talk much more about the process and how do we work with that. And also, the tools which we have as designers are much more geared towards designing a new thing rather than evidencing or intervening within processes and systems.
Or designing a future open.
So I wondered if you had any kind of tools or guidance for us and our students as we navigate this
kind of new space of design that we're trying to. I'm obsessed with active listening, like, and there's a really interesting thing that's sort of happening in school. Like I've got a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old, and the thing that keeps me up at night is like what they're taught at school and how crap it is, and how it's not preparing them for a really volatile future. And so, like, I'm part of this organisation called the Bio Leadership Project, and there we're having a lot of conversations about, okay, in the context of this poly crisis and this polarisation, like what is the tools that we need? And I think active listening, like to the ability to be able to truly listen. And because I still think, sorry, I'm not, it's a bit of an abstract answer, but like, still think that design, the way that we're training it, is still got this sort of ego inherent thing, which is like, I'm going to produce this thing and I make this thing. And it makes me think of like Maurizio Montalti, who was so forward thinking. He was like one of the first people to really work with mycelium, and he spent, I think, I can't remember how many years ago, he graduated design academy behind him, but he, really wanted to make mycelium factories, and he pushed it to the nth degree. But his initial graduation project was about materials to deconstruct. So basically he was growing mushrooms to dissolve things. He talked about how he thinks the future of design is getting rid of stuff, not making new stuff. And that, like, for me is like, whoa, like and how do we, and I feel like the sort of listening tool for some reason feels really critical to that, really key. And I still think that we don't really teach our students collaboration as a skill. Like, how do we, particularly in this polarization and this algorithmic, we're so like fed one thing, and design is often speaking to design. So I don't know, but yeah, there's something about like the removal of ego, is actually, can you use a design brief to get rid of stuff? We used to run a project, and actually it was inspired by Nancy Tilbury, who used to run the MA Fashioning Futures at Kingston, who was amazing. She was part of Phillips Pro sort of 25 years ago, when it was like her and Lucy McRae. And she ran a project called Zero, was the first project for the fashion students. And it was like, you've got what can you make with as close to zero in time, as close to zero in material, but it sort of nothing as a driver for innovation. So I don't know, I'm really interested in sort of briefs like that.
We are, I mean, it's interesting that you touch, and I think that's why you're going to see a lot of, because the brief we are running this year is measurable. And so it's precisely that we're deciding and working with materials perish. Right. It's just like, so we're taking like a starting point, the opposite, rather than an architecture or an interior that leaves a mark forever. Like that. It's more about how you work with things that perish. And so it's kind of, it does resonate a lot of things that you are that you are talking about.
Nice.
And how you position. And that's hence there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety, and because we know how to operate with permanence, we know how to operate with ego, in a way, but we haven't been taught how to operate with these other conditions like uncertainty, decay. We don't embrace them. Actually.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
Letting go.
What's the spectrum of that?
letting go of So it's I think it's been an interesting journey so far. You don't know the answer.
Nice.
I have no idea where I go. Everything what's done.
Hi. So I have a question. So as we've been like advancing on our other projects and really working with materials and started to know them or experiment them, I realized there's this really big and heavy, like double discourse of the materials that are sold that they are like eco-friendly, they can live like a circular life. And the other materials that are sold to be like us, but they are like really, there's a lot of greenwashing around like this type of like matter and all of this, right? So I really want to know like your opinion on this, and how do you think like we as designers can avoid falling into that? Because I've encountered like in my research a lot of companies that they said like, yeah, we're using like this textile that is going to decompose, but actually the process for that to decompose is to go through industrial processing, which is not really like the purpose. So yeah, I want to.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, when I was here, my research personally was all about sustainability in textiles, and I was in between my first and second year did this. Sorry, when it was 2 years I did this, and
Hope you're sorry.
this internship in India, and experience designing a textile that then is literally made next door in the factory. And then I came back and I had to earn some money, and so went to Manchester to work for a textile mill, and I was designing textile product that we was outsourcing to India, China. You know, you'd have to go there and they'd basically send the children home the days in the factory. So kind of experienced like both sides and the worst it could be, and like also experienced that it's so complicated. So there was at that point there was a massive rise in concern for organic cotton, and what we also saw in India was that there were farmers that were taking their fields out of production for 2 years to get this certification, in which time their families were dying. And so basically what I'm trying to say is it's a bloody minefield. And the only thing I believe that you can do, and this is what comes with, is to put the stake in the ground, to say that I understand that this is a complex landscape, and what I am doing is this, like really put your stake in the ground, say my emphasis is on this element. So I am not saying that, you know, I'm perfect, and this is what we've spent a long time with Target to say, like, you have got to say that this is a continual improvement. You're not, and you've got to be open and transparent about the things that aren't going, you know, that aren't working and that aren't sustainable. So yes, that's the only advice I could give there, I think, is to be really clear, to be informed holistically. But you can't, greenwashing comes from kind of just being general or
some marketing spin.
Yes,
but you're right about taking a position is absolutely
yes, absolutely right. Yes, and so does that help? Yeah. And I think it's fine to say my emphasis is on the social aspect. I'm empowering this community or I am working with this. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's fine to say that I'm doing one specific thing.
I think that's a great observation, because social impact isn't necessarily, it's quite difficult to measure that as well.
Yeah.
So that doesn't come through a company's report on how well they've done. But they're starting to. Yeah. So that sort of effect. And I guess, you know, we can't all stay in bed to be sustainable, can we?
And that's what we're sort of exploring in the regenerative materials library. That there are 9 principles, but there is no material that's going to cover one of those 9 principles. It's just not possible. So I think focus on what you are doing, pull that out, and then acknowledge that everything else is not perfect.
Can I ask you a question? And it's part advice, part actual question. If you were designing material processes, for example, for the built environment, the way we're doing in the RCA Design Practice, from being at the other end of the research spectrum, would you recommend that it makes more sense to work with regulation and understand British standards at the same time, so that where students learn to innovate in the regulation as well as the process of making the material?
Well, that's an interesting question.
That's a very good question.
I mean, yes, I don't think you could do anything but understand it, could you?
I mean, we're doing it separately right now. We're doing material process without really engaging with regulation and looking at policy and British standards and regulation separately. But something you mentioned in the presentation made me think, like, actually should they be in tandem so that?
I think they would have to be separate, because otherwise I think they would be taken to heart and limit the work. That's what I've seen time and time again. Because I think, like, if you think of, I don't know who's got great, but Assemble, like what they did in I can't remember what the project was, Liverpool. Granby Forestry.
Yeah.
But I think if you were aiming for a kind of a process, a system like that, and then you looked at the impact of legislation alongside it, or you looked at what it would, it's almost left brain, right brain.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, for me, I would worry that would it would be taken to heart.
Yeah.
So it's more dream, and then maybe compare how it performs against regulations.
And sort of to be informed, like, because we've just put our teams through carbon literacy training, just so that they can feel, kind of, I don't think they learn anything particularly, but like it just allowed them to feel literate in a certain vocabulary. If that's a lot of what our clients speak.
That's interesting. That
But I don't think running it alongside something that, like you say, that's more dream would support the dreaming. It's almost like technical. It makes me think of my colour chemistry lectures that at the time I literally wanted to kill myself. But right.
But even in the big companies you go into and you're running your 2-year research, there you're having to keep that separate. Otherwise, the naysayers and but we can't comes up too much and doesn't allow for that.
Yeah, it's funny because we're not commissioned by the naysayers, so we don't. That's more
the point.
The
keeping it separate.
Yeah, it is. There was one question in here, sorry.
No, I was just, I don't know if it's a question. Well, it is a question. Basically, I'm just picking up on the little things that we've been talking about. Like, you were talking about the ego. I really like bringing up the ego engine in the design process. Like, there's another truth I was talking about this problem with, like, the master architect that's going to save us, and, like, and how there's these very specialized sorts of makers in these massive conglomerate companies that are working tirelessly to come up with the thing that's going to save them. But especially when you mentioned the part about embracing the characteristics of nature in our products. If that is true, and then we have to embrace the slowness, and maybe we also have to accept shorter supply chains, meaning that we have to have less of a reliance on manufacturing industry corporations, and so then we also have to kind of become makers, like at an individual level, at a community level, like
Materium. That's what. So many students in the last 10 years have turned their kitchens into, material manufacturing.
But I wonder how do you see, because you work with these, obviously they have a lot of resources, they have a lot of people that are forward thinking, massive conglomerates, but they're also responsible in many cases for a lot of, like you mentioned, some materials are cheap, and others, like, it's cheaper like financially, but like the human cost where it's out, where the labor is outsourced. And
don't let me sell you a picture. Like, these companies are still like, we hit that all the time. It's still no, we're not going to do that because it's more expensive. So it's really exhausting and really depressing a lot of the time. There's like a few visionaries in companies that you find, the ones that, but I don't want to paint a picture of like, oh yeah.
Did you ever then feel like the impulse to kind of turn away from entertaining their sort of, because obviously they have all the money, they're the ones that